Hey Alpha fam, welcome back to another episode of Alpha Commission. Today I wanted to go over the Russia-Ukraine war situation. Now, some of you may not know this, but I have a background in international relations, basically international politics and economy with an emphasis in global peace and security, as well as East Asian studies. And so I am a little bit qualified, not the most qualified, but I am a little qualified to speak on these subjects and hopefully enlighten you about what's really going on. And, maybe we can get to the bottom of this. Well, it turns out, of course, that Biden was right. Russia is positioning itself to invade Ukraine. In fact, it's already begun the invasion. A lot of people thought that Russia would not start a war, but I don't know. When you move your troops into a foreign country, that's an act of war. So they have begun a war. And let's not mix words about it, right? If Russia had moved its troops into Texas, you would say that was that was an act of war against the United States. This is an act of war against Ukraine. The war has begun, okay? And we can see that in the markets, right? Whereas previously we thought that Bitcoin would get a nice bounce around $40,000, just a standard, pullback, fill in a CME gap on the professional charts, and then perhaps go and pop off to 46,000, maybe 48,000, maybe even those mid 55, 55,000, those mid 50,000s range, and then we could take it from there, right? Well, it didn't get the chance. This Russian war news just kept building and building. A lot of guys tried to deny it. The anti-Americans came out and tried to blame everything on the U.S. again, just like they always do. You see that in the rhetoric of these guys like Ran over at Crypto Banter. They don't know what they're talking about, okay? These guys have no knowledge of any of this. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about Russia. All they care about is their money, and so they don't care what they're saying. Well, these are real men and women in Ukraine, right? These are real human beings, elderly and children, babies, right? Fathers are going to be lost in this war, right? There are going to be broken up families, okay? People are going to lose a tremendous amount of property. And we're seeing that in the charts, okay? This is not irrational. This is not just, emotional. War has a real impact on the world. How can we quantify that? Well, Russia, has a certain amount of oil and gas. Russia has a certain amount of the precious metals that go into, building microchips and processors and, graphics cards. And if these supply chains are disrupted because of sanctions on countries, or if they're disrupted because there's war and it just can't flow, then of course prices go up. So what does that mean? If prices go up, then of course the charts go down, right? So now this is the result of Putin's work, is that instead of making money this week, we've all been losing money. Okay, and it was right to call it out. Again, it's not the most popular thing to say something like Biden was right, but Biden was right. Okay, most of us are part of the West in the sense that, we believe in, freedom. We believe in all these principles that maybe some of our leaders have forgotten about. Okay, maybe, Canada and some other countries are struggling with those issues, but we're still leading on those issues. And other countries like Turkey and Russia and China, they're not better on those fronts. Okay, we want to protect this Western worldview. We want to protect those values, and Ukraine was moving forward in that direction. Now, why is this such a tricky situation? Why hasn't the West just jumped to the aid of Ukraine? Why aren't we sending our military there to defend Ukraine? Why is Ukraine kind of by itself? Because, let's face it, it's a former Soviet state, okay, that still has a lot of corruption and a lot of history tied to Russia. A lot of its people are, in fact, Russians, right? I mean, historical Russians. They're Ukrainians, absolutely, they're Ukrainians, but they have ties historically to Russia, which means that there's a little bit more of this culture influencing Ukraine than, say, American culture, right? And that should just be common sense. Why would the U.S. want to send troops into Ukraine? If this is on the Russian border, used to be a Russian state, and also, you know, what would we gain out of it? What are we hoping to do? Well, you could say protect freedom, right? Protect those values. Yes, but at the expense of a nuclear war. I mean, there's a realistic perspective here also, right? Uh, you know, if Russia was invading, Canada or Mexico, right? Then of course we're going to come to aid, right? Because that's our vital national interest, right? That's right against our border. Our own citizens could die, right? However, Ukraine is kind of one of these buffer territories between this kind of Russian civilization and the Western civilization. So just like Belarus and some of these other countries, they are in between. And what we really want is to have kind of a neutral in between zone. We want these countries to kind of be neutral. We don't want them to be hardline Russian. We don't want them to be hardline Western. We want this to be a buffer that can communicate peace between our different civilizations as we grow together, as the world grows together. And that's what a lot of this institutional, you know, direction from the West has been about, trying to build bridges, trying to build institutions that can, first of all, push back, because obviously Russia is pushing forward. Sometimes they're assassinating leaders. And so the West, of course, also builds institutions to push back, like, for example, NATO, right? NATO is one of those things that has just been expanding. You can see here, the founders, Italy, France, United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, of course, the United States, Portugal. And then we have just expansion into these light green areas like Turkey, Spain, Poland, Germany, Hungary, Czech Republic. And of course, we also got some of these, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria. Wow, this is a lot of kind of like a former, you know, you know, Soviet sphere of influence states suddenly joining NATO, right? After 2000. Just started to creep up on Russia, started to creep up on Russia. So it's understandable that if you're Putin, basically nearly an octogenarian, right? I think he's 70 years old, right? Like why, why do we have all these like almost 80, 70-year-old leaders in the world? It's like, is there no young blood? Putin has been leading Russia for almost 25 years, okay? As a dictator now. He's basically a dictator. He's a czar, okay? We shouldn't even call him the president of Russia. He's the dictator of Russia. And, what Putin says goes, and he doesn't like this, understandably, perhaps. He's also so old, he comes from that Soviet generation. He can't think in other terms. He himself, Putin, was part of the KGB. In fact, I think it was like his first real job when he was 23. Putin joined the KGB, which of course is the Soviet version of the CIA, but you know much much more well trained in the dark arts of espionage and torture and all those things. Just murdering people, assassinations, just a grotesquely violent, suspicious, and paranoid organization, the KGB. And that's what Putin was born out of. So when he sees NATO stacking up along his borders and along what he perceived to be formerly part of the Soviet Union, right? So he thinks about it as if it's his home turf. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like it. And the fact that Ukraine was even considered, yet sticks so far into Russian territory, it has just it has just needled him in a way that is unimaginable to some people in the West, right? We think about this as, oh, we're just expanding the EU, we're expanding NATO, we're making friendly alliances for peace, for defense. And from Putin's perspective, you're just chipping away at the Soviet Union, which, as a dictator, he believed that maybe in his own lifetime he could rebuild, right? And so he grabbed Crimea. He's had other wars, and basically, this is kind of like a lifelong dream of Putin's to reincorporate part of these territories, if not as much as he can grab. And he hasn't been able to do that. He hasn't been able to do that. But Ukraine is a little bit more complex of a situation, and we'll get to it later. But I really want you to understand this situation because a lot of people are talking about it just very lazily, and they don't understand what they're talking about. Okay, so this is just makes it a little bit more clear. The previous chart said that strong potential candidates, Ukraine and Georgia. That's not true. That's not true. Okay, so take everything with a grain of salt. Okay, Germany would veto Ukraine coming into NATO. They've already said it blatantly, and they're not going to break their promise on that. Also, nobody really wants Ukraine in NATO. They actually want Ukraine to reform and westernize, and it could take decades. Okay, it could take decades. Ukraine is a very corrupt state. Let's just not split hairs, okay? They have an old history of the old Soviet kind of culture of government, which is very corrupt. And they also have some history of fascism, just dramatic fascism that really is terrifying to Russians because the ethnic Russians have sometimes been on the losing side of that once Ukraine was independent. And of course, most countries go through these type of processes. The United States obviously had a very dark past. Europe had a very dark past. Um, Almost every big region in the world, every country in the world has had a dark past as it formalizes a national identity. And but it's really scary when you have fascist in charge, right? And let me just underscore this a little bit more. This area of Ukraine, okay, so let's just go back to the map, right? So here's Ukraine, right? So we're just zooming in on this area. So the ethnic breakdown in Ukraine was basically this is kind of like the western area of Ukraine, and they're primarily Ukrainian speakers. Okay, you got some Hungarians over here, and of course, this is not a homogenous state. Let's just put it that way. Okay, but you do have these very Russian-speaking areas where there's a significant amount of the Russian population in here. There's a Russian-speaking population, and then of course, in Crimea, you had a Russian majority. And so, from a Russian historical perspective, because let's face it, the Cold War wasn't that long ago, right? It's one lifetime. So, from a living memory historical perspective, this is Russia, right? This is Russia. This is Russia from a Russian perspective. Okay, it's sort of like if Florida broke off and became part of Cuba, it wouldn't make sense to, it wouldn't make sense to Americans. Okay, but of course there's a huge, Cuban population, ethnic Cuban population in Florida. And so, you can see the cultural conflict that arises out of this when it happens within one generation. And Putin knows he's getting older. He's not going to be around forever. This may be the last chance to carve out a piece of Ukraine, if not take it over completely and reincorporate it into a new kind of like neo-Soviet, you know, uh, neo-Soviet Union underneath this kind of Tsar Putin, not really communist, but also just something new, right? The world is changing, fascism is rising, dictatorships are becoming stronger, and democracies are weakening. And so Putin knows that this may be his chance to do it, and that the historical moment, historical chance to do it, may die with him. Now, that may sound very noble from a Russian perspective, but it's not very noble if you're if you're Ukrainian, right? And of course, this is one state. This is one state. It's not multiple countries. It's one country. And we can show that. We can show that because you might be thinking, "Oh, well, why not just like East and West Germany? Why don't we just build a wall down the middle and separate them into two different countries?" Well, first of all, from an international relations perspective, that's not an ideal situation. You don't want the West and, and Russia having guns pointed directly at each other when they're both nuclear power, right? You don't want this to be NATO and the West, and this to be kind of like a neo-Soviet Union under Putin with nuclear weapons pointed directly at each other and a wall barring families from crossing, all that stuff. You want to avoid that as much as possible. And the ideal situation is, again, kind of a neutral Ukraine that kind of does its own thing, maybe isn't part of NATO, but just shares intelligence with NATO and gets maybe funding from the West and then kind of support to resist any corruption that might be coming from the Russians, help defend against the possibility of cyber attacks, those sort of things. You don't really want a hard border with somebody who is an adversary. And let's just show like why it also wouldn't really make sense to do that. Here we have a vote, whether or not the Ukrainians wanted to be independent from the Soviet Union. Okay, and when Ukraine had a referendum on its independence from the Soviet Union, this entire territory, basically the majority said, yeah, we want to keep our independence. We don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. We've made the right decision to be independent from the Soviet Union. And so you can see uh, this is huge. This is almost all of Ukraine except for Crimea. Crimea only 50 to 60% voted yes, which is still a majority. The majority of even Crimeans said, yes, we want to be Ukrainians. We are Ukrainians, right? Even though the vast majority of them, even though the vast majority of them are ethnic Russian, they still said, we want to be Ukrainians. We don't see ourselves as part of a Russian empire. We see ourselves as part of Ukraine for better or for worse, right? And of course, a lot of people aren't going to be happy in this region. You have like separatist movements, you have kind of civil war type situations going on. Again, it's early in this country's life, but it has a long history for thousands of, again, Ukraine is an old culture. It's not like it was just created by Russia or Lenin, which is what Putin went on TV trying to say that, Lenin created, Ukraine, which is ridiculous. Europe has existed for, the entire time that mankind has been recorded, and these ethnicities have, just prospered there. So of course Russians do exist in Ukraine, but of course Russians exist in the United States. That doesn't mean that Russia has a right to, American territory, right? So again, okay, let's just look at another chart of this just to see the breakdown, because this goes to, what is feasible, what could be a solution if, war is the only way forward. How could we negotiate our way out of it? Well, you can see the percentage of ethnic Russians in Ukraine by region in 2001. Look, only 39%, 38%, 25%, right? 20%. The rest of this is just low double digits, 10, 15%, 5%, 2.4%, right? So very low amount of Russians over here. Of course, they're important. They're the citizens of Ukraine. Their voices matter. But it's not like we're talking about, 90% Russian. We're not talking about, pure Russian. Even here in Crimea, 58% Russian, right? So, and that's just ethnicity. That's not nationality. These Russian Ukrainians, they might just see themselves as Ukrainian, the same way as a Russian American might just see themselves as American, right? They just happen to have family that was born in Russia and a long history of their family in Russia, right? It doesn't mean that they're loyal to some Russian emperor, empire, or that they want to bow down to Putin, or that they want their freedom taken away in some type of new, neo-Soviet kind of Leninist, dream or whatever that Putin has cooked up in his mind from having his entire life beginning with, the KGB. But this has a history in it's not just the Cold War that impacts it, it's also World War II. During World War II, of course, the fascists, Hitler and all those guys, they made a march into Russia and they really trashed up the place, quite a bit. Of course, the Russians defeated, Hitler's attempts, but they were very close to succeeding. And having, you know, kind of a high fascist percentage in Western Ukraine on your border is not something that they would like because, from a Russian perspective, well, maybe just like there's the possibility of, a dictatorship in the United States, we saw. Whether or not it was orchestrated by some of Trump's people, or whether it was, the, just spontaneous. We saw basically an attack on our Congress while votes were being counted for a presidential election in the United States. Who's to say that just ignore what happened during the Trump era? Okay, of course it was incredibly shocking, but just ignore that. Who's to say that it couldn't happen again and then some fascist is installed in the United States? Or what if in the future that kind of fascism reasserts itself in Germany, and let's say that Germany has the leadership of the EU, and then down the line, maybe decades from now, right? Maybe 50 years, 70 years from now, we see a situation where there's fascist in Europe and they have basically this bridge into into Russia because it just sticks into the side of Russia again like a thorn, right? Like it's just this direct access to the heart of Russia. Well, Putin's perspective, having been the leader of basically an empire, is that this is a huge vulnerability for his civilization. And, as he gets later on in life, he might be thinking, well, I need to do what I can to protect Russia. Again, former, leadership, I think lieutenant, a high lieutenant actually in the KGB, and also, the president of Russia and the dictator of Russia, basically its new czar. And so what's he going to do about it? Well, he's making his move. You can see, he has like 100, to 200,000 troops basically surrounding Ukraine right now. And he's already stepped foot into the area. He's already sent troops in, and he's now supporting this. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. Donetsk, Luhansk, these type of regions, and he's making the case on national TV that not only these areas that are, that are held by these separatists, basically this kind of like civil war region, it's just a small part of, just small part of Ukraine, right? Just this kind of like area right over here, but also this wider region. He's making the case that this wider region, should be independent. And of course, if it's independent, what does that mean? That it could vote to be part of Russia. And if you have Russian troops stationed in those areas of Ukraine, then you can force a vote. And of course, they're going to vote to be part of Russia if you've got the Russian military, holding guns outside the voting booths. Okay, we've seen how this stuff works, right? Like, that's what they do in North Korea. That's what they do in, you know, that's what they used to do in Iraq, right? And so now we see that the end game of Russia is to actually have conquest, to actually conquer land. He's already taken over Crimea. He's now invading these two regions. And the question is, with all his troops positioned here, he's even got troops in Moldova, that could, and they could strike from Belarus at the capital of Ukraine. Is he going to just take over the capital, decapitate the government, send in this massive army, and then just take Ukraine? Just take the entire Ukraine. If he does that, then we're going to see prices to continue to go down. Of course, prices are going to continue to go down because all that natural gas, all that oil, all those electronics, the tech sector being hit, and let's not make any mistake about it. Bitcoin is part of the tech sector, right? If the tech sector takes a hit, then also, this is going to impact, blockchain technology, and so here we are, Bitcoin just traveling down. Lower highs, lower lows in a downward channel instead of what was supposed to be an upward channel, right? This was supposed to be a positive week, but we're in this downward channel getting exaggerated by the market pricing in the cost of war. And they're not 100% sure what the final price tag is going to be. Is it going to be just these two small regions where, Putin basically already has his troops? He basically already has his killers in there. Is he going to expand it to these regions and just to really take over a huge chunk of Ukraine right away, surgically, with minimal bloodshed in the most heavily Russian dominated areas, which, let's face it, right? It's not even that Russian. It's 40% max. And then these poor areas with 25% only, that means 75% not Russian, right? So, how can you justify that? Well, we don't know if he's going to expand it. We don't know how far he's going to expand it. We just have this type of like cutout area. And, this is this could be done pretty surgically, right? Just like Crimea. It could be done pretty surgically. But if he expands it wider and wider and wider, and if he comes down to capture the capital, then we're going to have a total war. We're going to have a total civil war, a total war. And, you know, Putin's 70 years old, right? He doesn't care, right? He's going to die anyway, right? He's already calculated in the loss of life, when he signed up for the KGB, when he was 23 years old. And so he knows that, bloodshed is part of life and that people die and that what's left is your thumbprint on history. And he's been, the dictator of Russia for almost 25 years now, and he wants to leave his thumbprint on the Soviet Union, a neo-Soviet Union under a Russian czar, basically himself, and we don't know exactly what his endgame is going to look like, but it could be dire for the economy. It could be dire for the economy. I think we've priced in these movements just into these small ones, maybe these slightly expanded regions, which cause extra pain because you're going to get a lot of fighting. The more you expand this, you're going to get a lot more fighting, a lot more disruptions. And the one thing that really hasn't been totally priced into the market so far is Germany has decided to basically stop the Nord Stream 2, which was a pipeline that would have supplied gas and energy basically to Germany and to Europe, from Russia. And the fact that this is being cut off, this project is ending, means that this alliance, this type of division that Russia was trying to build with Germany by making some type of economic integration with Germany around the rest of these states, just bypassing them and working with Germany on energy projects directly. That's now gone away. You can from Germany's perspective, they were going to get cheap energy, and they were also going to get to have a chance to make cultural connections with Russia and perhaps build the relationship over the next generation, right? From the Russian perspective, they were going to be able to highly impact the German economy in a way that would make Germany more reluctant to be against Russian policies, as perhaps Putin built up, shored up its Western Front. And so, as the UK has left the European Union, right, more or less, that left leadership mostly in the hands of France and Germany. Of course, Poland is also very important, as very strategic here. And so, but Germany is probably the most important one for the European alliance. And what we can say is that the more that Germany is influenced by Russia, the less strong the EU is as a buffer against potential future Russian aggression. And so, the U.S. has been pushing for that the Nord Stream 2 energy project to be canceled. A lot of European countries have, argued that it should be canceled because it threatens, the economic security of the European Union. And you know, but Germany has basically said no. Time and time again, Germany has said no. And finally, they're saying, okay, we see you, Russia, you're invading Ukraine. That's a step too far. That's a step too far. We're going to cancel this project. They didn't fully cancel it. They actually they just stopped the process, right? So German's very practical, very step by step. And so it's still being dangled out there as a potential carrot. This may have caught Russia by surprise because I think Russia thought that that was such a huge prize, such an expensive undertaking, such a profitable endeavor for Germany to take, that it was basically an offer that Germany couldn't refuse. But Germany has been actually much stronger than many thought that they would be. And, while there's been a lot of institutionalist, actually, Germany has been one of the strongest to try to resist what Russia is doing. And now they're actually putting a huge amount of money where their mouth is in the potential loss of this project. So kudos to Germany. I think they caught Putin off guard with that. And then Putin, of course, came out with a crazy tirade, claiming that, Russia basically created Ukraine, and so they're gonna like, I don't know what his point is, right? Like, kind of like we made you, so we can break you, right? Even if we can't own you, we can break you, right? And so, what's, you know, we've talked about the World War II, the kind of fascist history and the invasion of Russia, from Germany, and why these civilizations don't see eye to eye, right? We have World War II, we have the Cold War. Obviously, this is a dictatorship, this is kind of a liberal democracy, and Ukraine's in the middle. Ukraine's in the middle, being pulled apart at the seams in both directions. But also, it's the issue of NATO expansion and then Russia, kind of like a neo Soviet dictatorial attempt to expand. And we also have, of course, the EU expansion, right? The EU itself is a new organization, which is kind of similar to what the Soviet Union was, but of course for Western Europe. And so Russia and Putin, they may be thinking, well, we need to shore that up because the balance of power is tipping towards Europe. The balance of power is one which Russia may never again, may never again be as powerful as it once was unless I, Putin, take steps to balance the power now. Europe is going to have the upper hand. And by gaining Ukraine, that's going to be such a slap in the face that it's better to steal it now than to lose it forever. Because the Ukrainian people are changing. Not only are they, nationalistically Ukrainian. They all believe that they are Ukrainian, even the most Russian of them, except for the separatist, this kind of small separatist movement, which it's not insignificant, but it is small compared to the rest of Ukraine. You know, this country is moving to the west. This country is becoming more and more like Poland and Hungary and Germany, and they're moving culturally, and the internet and European culture and European identity, and then of course the concept of NATO security. It just you're talking about the creation of an empire, right? This was never in modern day history a single block. And even today, there's bickering all over the place. You saw UK pull away from the EU, right? And it's so hard to string these pieces together, right? It's not the Roman Empire, and even the Roman Empire was basically on shoestring. This but this is really becoming something very formidable that in the future could it could be a United States of Europe, essentially. And that might be a little bit offensive to some people's ears, but it's headed in that direction. It's headed in that direction if it doesn't break up, right? And so Russia, of course, is trying to sow division. That's why Russia is meddling in the elections, trying to push people that, into power that it thinks is more friendly to Russia. It's trying to divide populations with disinformation so that they elect people who, Russia feels is more favorable to Russia. And, Russia it feels itself backed into a corner. And it's not really necessary. There's not going to be an invasion of Russia. Russia is a major nuclear power. No one is going to come in and just take over Russia. In fact, the biggest threat that Russia has comes from its own people. Again, Putin has been basically a dictator for 25 years. That doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Russians do see themselves as European. They don't like to be thought of as just like barbarians on the east, right? Like these uncivilized barbarians. No, they see themselves as, sophisticated, intelligent Europeans. And because of that identity, they also are very open to the concepts of the West. And when you have countries right on your border falling like dominoes, one by one, into NATO, into Europe, you can just think, oh, there might be a Russian revolution soon. There might be a Russian revolution soon. And so Russia really wants that buffer. Just like, if you're a realist, it would be good to have a buffer on Russia's border. You don't really want to make Ukraine a NATO state because then if there's any attack over here, then you have to send in troops and defend it. And now you have the Russian military and the US military fighting. You don't want that. You want a buffer state, right? You want a friend state who you support as much as you possibly can. But when, Biden says that I'm not sending troops into Ukraine, he's right. You don't want to send American troops right here. Why would you send American troops right here uh, it's basically into Russian territory. You're gonna trigger a nuclear war. So he's 100% right. The only way to solve this is with sanctions, and as weak as that is, because national security almost always trumps, um, national security is almost always prioritized over financial security. So you can take a short-term financial hit, even if it was a 10-year recession. You can take a 10-year recession, but what you can't lose is national security, because then your country can be toppled. You could have a revolution. You could have an invasion, right? You don't know what course history might take. And so, of course, a 10-year recession is worth that. And that's why, you know, all of these strategic sanctions and financial consequences against Russia, it's not going to change the fact that Putin is going to make the decision to either have a small war and just stand by what he already said, have those small areas break off, and then probably they just get incorporated into Russia the way that he incorporated Crimea, or he's going to do a bigger region, and then it's going to be a bloody civil war, and that's going to cause chaos on his border. But it could be manageable, and then you may be seeing, walls being built, things like that. And depending how far he goes in, it could get quite bad, and energy could be disrupted quite a lot, and the supply chain of like precious metals and different things for computing and the tech sector could get severely disrupted. Or you could talk about a total war, where troops are moved in from the south, from the north, from the northeast, right? And from the southeast and from the east, and they just push through, take the capital, decapitate Ukraine, replace its government, and then have all these troops all these Russian troops lined up right against Europe, right against Europe, right, right. The same way that Ukraine pokes into Europe, it pokes into Russia, it pokes into Europe. And so, but these will be Russian troops right in the heart of Europe. And Russia will once again be in the heart of Europe. And that may be something that Putin wants. It might be a life endeavor of him, as somebody in the KGB who grew up in the KGB basically and saw his country fractured. It may be a lifelong endeavor to repair at least some of that damage from his historical perspective. And I hope that gave you a historical perspective on what's going on in Russia and why it's seemingly as intractable as it is, and why the West, despite all of our power, all of our, collective security, all of our shared interest, there's very little that we can do about it. And to be honest, there's very little that we want to do about it, because at the bottom line, the bottom line is that no country is going to act outside of its national interest. It's a vital national security interest. There, you can have stupid wars, right? Like a Bush fought really stupid wars. I mean, I think Iraq was probably one of the biggest blunders that the world has ever seen, and it was based upon, factually documented, lies, right? Intentional lies to the American people, with that was started by the greatest of intentions, right? But those intentions were no less nefarious than Putin's intentions on Ukraine. Okay, slightly less selfish, because we didn't want to incorporate Iraq into the United States. We didn't want a puppet state. It's slightly less nefarious because Russia is also defending its dictatorship, right? Its neo-Soviet kind of dictatorship that it has going on. Whatever this neo-czarist, you know, government style, we need new names for these things. Whatever's being developed, that's not what the US was doing in Iraq. Um, but we've done it too, right? We've done it too because we do see an American empire. We do see a Western empire, right? It's consolidating into the EU, right? It's consolidating into NATO. It's toppling dictators and installing democracies because we believe that those things are more favorable to the West. And so great powers do these type of things, and we see those situations as in our vital interest when they're in specific areas of the world that touch other vital interest. For example, Iraq is in the Middle East and is an oil producing country. And you can say that the war in Iraq wasn't about oil, and you would be correct. But at the same time, it was about protecting uh, an area of the world which we see as a vital national security interest because of oil. And so the US didn't go in and we don't own any oil fields in Iraq. You know, I think Trump was saying if he was fighting, if he had fought the Iraq war instead of Bush, this is like a neoconservative versus I don't know, like a neo-Soviet kind of conservative perspective. Trump was saying that he would have taken over the oil fields, and I don't know what it nationalized them for the United States or something, and occupy and taken it as like treasure or something. I mean, just like crazy thoughts that you would expect from a Russian dictator. Taking over the production fields of Ukraine. Like for Russia, and but the United States doesn't do that, right? The United States doesn't do that. We used to do that back when we were an empire. And make no mistake about it, we were a proper formal empire. I mean, Hawaii didn't just volunteer to be part of the United States, right? The Native Americans didn't just willingly give up their land, okay? And Russia is still going through this process, and that, and just because we've left it behind largely and the West has left it behind, it doesn't mean that the rest of the world has. You're going to find that this precedent, whatever happens with Ukraine, China's going to be learning from that when it comes to thinking about islands in the Southeast Pacific, when it comes to thinking about Taiwan, when it comes to thinking about islands that are near Japan but also near China, which people don't understand. But Japan is ready to go to war over that. They are ready to go to war if China makes a move on it, and China wants to make a move on it. China sees Southeast Asia and East Asian islands as their kind of Soviet Union that they want to grow. And so a natural partnership between the West and Russia can exist as a balance of power against China, because that's the real threat to the Western Empire, to the American Empire in the future, is China. It's not Russia. You hear a lot of people, a lot of these octogenarians, right? These 80-year-olds and 70-year-olds, which no offense to them, it's just that they grew up in the Cold War. They were born right after, World War II or during World War II or right before it, and they lived they lived under fascist. They lived when the United States was literally an empire taking over small countries, incorporating it into the US, or incorporating land into the US. And they lived, at a time when these things made a lot of sense to big players in the world, and where they spent their entire life under the threat of nuclear war. A lot of them, they can't, especially the ones who've been just entrenched in politics, a lot of them just can't get past it. And a lot of leaders can't either. And so we're not all in agreement on how to go forward. And it doesn't mean it's bad policy or good policy. It just means that these policies have to match. And where they don't match, there's going to be conflict. So I have no doubt that the West, that NATO, that the United States, they just want Ukraine as a buffer state. And I have no doubt that Russia just wants Ukraine as a buffer state. It's just we can't agree on the policies to get there. You know, Russia doesn't want a civil war. It doesn't want a war. It doesn't want people coming into Russia from Ukraine fomenting revolution because they killed the families of Ukrainians. They don't want that. They want to just influence Ukraine and have a buffer state from the West, and so that Russia can do its own thing and have no worries about Ukraine whatsoever. But that's also what the West wants. Right? That's also what the West wants. And those two things aren't compatible. And so at some point, we need fresh blood. We need new leadership in Russia. We need to get rid of these kind of like Cold War thinkers. And then that type of perspective that, Obama had can maybe someday, can work out. But I've criticized conservatives, leaders a few times here. So let me just say that, you know, uh, Obama made a ton of mistakes on the from an international relations perspective. He thought that he belonged to a new generation of, I don't know, of internationalists that could think about the world in a completely new way. And frankly, the world wasn't ready for that, okay? And to be honest, the way that history is going right now, it might not be ready for that in our lifetimes. So we're going to have to work through these problems, and we just need fresh blood who didn't grow up in the KGB, who didn't grow up with nuclear weapons over their head, but at the same time understands how important that history is and how to make solutions for it, because Russia and Europe are going to need to balance power against China along with the United States, and this is going to be something that's going to reshape the world. And so we can't have Russia being our enemy. We can't just demonize Russia. We have to understand that this is Putin's decision, that he sees it as part of his historical destiny, his life ambition to protect this Soviet Union. And before he dies, he's going to do his damnedest to make sure that he gets part of that done. But the West and the United States and Russia, they need to be positioning themselves to work together as China grows and as it becomes a, a greater and greater threat to the world's security, as well as it rebalances power in not just Southeast Asia, where the Chinese economy basically can control smaller Asian economies, and in a quite threatening way, right? In a quite threatening way, because I think like 50% of the South Korean economy depends on China, and don't quote me on that, but it's getting up there. I think about South Korea, one of the United States' strongest allies, right? The only country in the world that has joint control powers over portions of the US military, South Korea. They are like almost 50%, if maybe more now, of their economy is influenced by China. And so this is going to reshape relationships because countries that aren't as powerful as South Korea, they're going to be extremely vulnerable to China in the coming years. And without even invading, China has been stacking African countries, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American countries in its favor. And it will continue to do so unless Russia, the European Union, as an almost United States of Europe, not just as a bunch of, smaller countries arguing about who can use the name champagne, right, on their wine, right? As a collective security organization that understands the importance of, history and the future of the world, hangs in the balance as the rise of empires and as the rise of dictators, as authoritarianism is on the increase. Whereas it had been on the decrease since the 1950s, it's now on the increase, where democracy is threatened by fake news, by deep faked videos, deep faked voices, deep faked intelligence that's written by AI systems that are just spread throughout the internet, and where lies and deception are winning and fracturing democracies because we all have a right to our voice, right? So the government can never say what's right or wrong. And if the government starts to do that, then we accuse the government of being a dictator, and then people start favoring dictators, right? It's how democracies fall. And so if we don't hang together, right? If Europe doesn't hang together, if Europe and the West, which includes like Japan and South Korea and other democracies, if we don't hang together and resist the temptation to move in authoritarian paths ourselves, and if we don't, battle and combat these type of movements, then you know we're going to see more states like Ukraine or potentially Taiwan or other states, just fall or move in the direction of authoritarianism, which has been renewed by the efforts of Russia and to a different extent China, as well as other movements, including in our own countries where fascists are starting to rise again and authoritarians are starting to run for office, and where lies are becoming so easy to spread. And we may be obsessed with that because that threatens us directly in our hometowns, in our own elections, for our own countries. And so we can easily look at Russia. But we also have to understand that there's a bigger context in that as China grows and as Russia expands and as democracies suffer these setbacks, here or there, it doesn't matter if it's for 4 years or 40 years, as these setbacks happen, authoritarianism is growing, and alliances between these authoritarians are strengthening. Like we've basically pushed Russia to start making stronger alliances with China, whereas previously our policy was to separate Russia and China. But by not taking this Ukrainian situation as seriously as we should have in the Obama during the Obama administration, which it's not all on Obama. Europe also has their say, of course. Ukraine has their say, of course. It's not just Obama, but he didn't make it any better, right? He didn't think about it. He didn't take it as seriously as it should have, and now we're having war. And again, it's also on Putin. He's the one making the actual decision. He's the one actually sending troops. And hopefully we can learn from this. But at the same time, we have to understand there's three levels of war that are possible. Just a quick surgical occupation, an expansion, and kind of a civil war, with Russia putting its thumb on the scales, and perhaps just monetary support from the West, or a total invasion. And I'm not sure which it's going to be because Germany cutting off that pipeline, right, to Russia, and trade. If trade is being cut off, and Russia gets very isolated, and its oligarchs, its billionaires that are under the approval of Putin, if the bank accounts get cut off, if money gets drained, well, Russia and Putin his position isn't as strong as it used to be. He's now known as a dictatorial thug, even by Russians, even by Russian standards. He's known as that. They're not celebrating Ukraine the way that they celebrated, Crimea, because they know these are Ukrainians. These aren't Russians. These are Ukrainians. Yeah, these were a majority, almost a majority Russians. Yeah, in this small area, maybe majority, but not not more than that. It becomes backwards to history. And so at the same time, he's suppressing his own people, cracking down, locking up thousands and thousands of people who just want rights, locking them up. It's old Cold War tactics all over again. And the Russian people thought that they thought that they had a chance at freedom and democracy. They thought that they had a chance at it. And a generation has just grown up under Putin, wondering what they missed out on. And so Putin is in a fragile place more than ever. He's coming towards the end of his life, perhaps. Even if he lives to 100, it's only another 20, it's only another, well, I guess it could be another 30 years. He's a 70, right? So he could live quite a while, actually. But he's getting older, right? There are going to be threats that he's just not going to be able to accommodate. And the world is getting more sophisticated and more integrated. And so, he's more vulnerable than ever, especially as Europe unites more than ever. And this was kind of a special, so I did make it longer than usual, but just wanted to share that perspective. If you're still listening, thanks for listening to the whole thing. And that was your alpha for the day. Stay safe out there, guys. We're still trading just within this downward channel, getting rejected off of the top each time. Maybe we'll break through. Maybe we'll break through and have some bullishness. Otherwise, I expect us perhaps to fall back down to the bottom of the channel, perhaps finding support around 35,500-ish. Maybe, maybe. If we don't find the energy, the momentum to break through. And yeah, happy trading.